Hey everyone, I'm Dan from JazzComposersPresent.com, an online space where composers, musicians, and listeners come together to celebrate the music we love. I'm joined today by Ed Partyka, trombonist, composer, conductor, and longtime member of the Bob Brookmeyer New Art Orchestra. Ed is here to show us how focusing on subtle details can make your music unique, interesting, and worthy of repeated listening.
Let's talk a little bit about sometimes, when we write backgrounds or accompaniments for melodies, sometimes when we write voicings for maybe the trombone section or the reed section, it can be any section, sometimes we get a little too pedantic, and sometimes our voicings are they're all very correct, but sometimes maybe they're lacking a little bit of something interesting that sort of makes people want to listen again, or sometimes our things, they lack something that maybe makes the players feel less like an individual and maybe more like, the finger of a pianist, because one of the things that got me to thinking about this subject was the fact that one of my students just had a big band piece of his played. And one of the complaints that came from the trombone section was they said, listen, you're basically just written piano voicings for us. And if you're the third trombone player, that basically means you're this finger. If you're the bass trombone player, you're this finger. And sometimes we do also have to think about some small details that can make the music more interesting, but also remember that the players, every member of the orchestra, is a human being, and maybe trying to give them also some interesting things to do. So let's maybe talk about how I do this, and let's get the first slide up. This is a chord progression, and I was going to write some backgrounds and accompaniment for Sophisticated Lady. And basically, the first thing I do when I start out is I write very, very solid voicings. And in this case, you make some decisions. What type of voicing is it going to be? What's the voicing density going to be? How many voices am I going to have? What is sort of the general harmonic language? And what's the range going to be? So, so in this case, I made just 4-part spread voicing, so I have the root and the bottom, the third and the seventh, and then mainly basic chord tones and very, very sort of almost consonant harmony, very, very little harmonic tension, a lot of times the fifth, maybe a ninth, So just keeping sort of basic voicings like that. And then, of course, when I do it like this, in this case, I did not want the range very high, middle of the register, middle of the staff for the bass clef staff. And then also making sure that the voicing was good. So then the next step from that, once I have the basic voicings, that'll be the next slide, is then to think about, okay, if everything is sort of happening on beat 1, which it does because all the harmonies change on 1, do I have to have that all, And then this also leads me to think, a little bit about the types of music where there's a strong emphasis on 1. And that's generally, march music and pop music and folk music. So if we are writing something in in a jazz style, we are definitely going to want to have some more rhythmic variety. We're going to want to have things anticipated. We're going to want to have syncopation. And that comes, that's talking a little bit about how things are going to ebb and flow. So, so one of the first things I did here was remove things off beat 1 in the first bar and the third bar. In the first bar, putting it on beat 2, and then, of course, in the third bar, as you can see, putting it on 1 and. So, generally the ands of the beat, so if we're talking about a 4 and or a 2 and, they're going to be moving things forward, helping the flow. And if we have something on the beat, it's going to make it very stable, and sometimes that's going to help, to maybe pull the brakes. So if we're talking about an ebb and a flow, this is some of the things we can start thinking about. So once we have that, let's move on to the next slide, where then I'm going to start, asking the question, now that I've adjusted some of the rhythms, does everything really have to line up so nicely and vertically? Could I start to maybe have some independent melodic motion in the voices? And very often, where I try to put this independent motion, melodic motion, is in the inner voices. Maybe asking some tension, some harmonic tension, adding some tension so that we get a little bit of tension and release. Once again, this also contributes to the ebb and flow. And then once again, thinking about maybe displacing some movement and making sure that not everything is lining up exactly the same. And then maybe, there are some staggered, there is some staggered motion. So what we can see here is in the first bar, On the way to the fifth of the E flat chord, the B flat, I've added the sharp 11, adding a little bit of tension, a little bit of motion, and then in the next bar, well, as you can see, I talked about using a unifying element, and so continuing that idea of the sharp 11, or sharp 4, whatever, resolving up to the fifth. And of course, what I said before with rhythm, well, I'm using a triplet in the first bar, and then eighth notes in the second bar, so that does sort of slightly accelerate things. In the third bar, if you take a look at the first trombone part also, staggering the movement, the third and fourth parts move on beat 3, and there I've staggered the movement so that the first part moves on beat 4. So all of a sudden, just some little things, and all of a sudden everything's not lining up quite as nicely as it did before. Let's move on to the next slide, where we then look again at maybe one or two of the voices that are going to be maybe the people who are featured here, someone having, as I call it, a moment of glory. So this is sort of, if we look at the second trombone part, that's what's happening here. And in the fourth bar, I've added a little descending line. So all of a sudden, the second part, does sort of have a nice little melodic arch. And then also together with the first trombone part, we have quite a bit of, sort of staggered melodic motion and movement. And then the other thing I start to think about is if I have repeated notes, how I'm going to deal with them. Am I going to tie them over? Will there maybe be some sort of neighboring tone or some sort of connecting tone, or will I have just a repeated note? I generally try to avoid re-articulating something, so in this case, adding some ties. And then, since we did start out with a very, very sort of basic harmonic language, as this arrangement progressed, I wanted to start to add some more harmonic tension, some more dissonance. So in the fourth bar, I didn't only add this little descending line in the second trombone. Of course, it lands on the third of the E minor, and I kept the F sharp hanging there, so we get our first little half step rub. So once again, this is sort of how these things sort of start to develop. And then the final step will be the next slide, where then I do add articulations and dynamics. So here, everything's going to be generally legato for these phrases, but of course, telling everyone exactly where the phrase begins and ends through the nice legato mark. There is going to be a crescendo leading to mezzo forte, and then, of course, at the end, bring us back. So rounding this out and adding some shape to the lines. Why don't we go to the first little score example with the recording so we can hear how this works within the actual context of the arrangement. So we'll get to hear a bit of the melody from Sophisticated Lady and this trombone background. So hopefully those are some small details that where the listener will maybe want to listen to that twice, where they'll think, oh, what is that happening behind or below the French horn solo, French horn melody? And of course, for the players, it hopefully makes their parts a little bit more interesting. And everybody actually does feel more like an individual instead of just, somebody's finger, the finger of a pianist who's doing some comping. You can see, of course, in the full score, I have doubled the trombones and tuba with the clarinets, including clarinet, alto clarinet, bass clarinet, and contrabass clarinet. And now we're going to listen to a slightly longer, section of the backgrounds. And actually, the other thing you can see is how I'm trying to move some of the rhythmic things off of the beat, and also how I'm trying to alternate between different voicing styles. Because, of course, something like this, a 4-part spread voicing, if you use that too much, it can become very, very saturating and sort of heavy. So, of course, what we'll hear now is also how I tried to alternate that with some unison lines, some 2-part things, and, of course, adding a nice dose of, dissonance occasionally. So enjoy this slightly longer version of Sophisticated Lady, where you can see a lot of the things I just talked about being demonstrated. Okay, and that is my arrangement of Sophisticated Lady. The alto saxophone soloist is Florian Trübsbach, and that's from the album In the Tradition, the Ed Partyka Jazz Orchestra. I hope you enjoyed this mini lesson.
Thanks for watching today's mini lesson. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Drop any questions, comments, or suggestions for future videos down below. To watch our full-length events and participate in live Q&As with our presenting artists, head to jazzcomposerspresent.com. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.